Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to give you a bit of a talk and a conversation about food security. And the title of the talk is Food Security is Energy Security. Energy security is food security. And we aren't faring well on either front. I run a company called Grow Intelligence, which is an AI and data platform focused on enhancing the world's understanding of our food systems. We, over the past 8 years, have launched over 2 million different models that help us predict and understand the supply and demand of agricultural products around the world on both a real-time and a predictive basis. That has helped us understand the deep interlinkages that exist between our food systems and our agricultural systems with other systems we're not paying attention to. And energy today is that one system. The interlinkage between energy and agriculture is the deepest it's ever been. So how, you might ask? Well, it's linked in two ways. The first is through the inputs. Fertilizer is an input to grow our crops. And to develop nitrogen-based fertilizers, 75 to 90% of the cost is associated with natural gas. This is really important because basically the price of natural gas determines the price of our crops. The price of fertilizer makes up 30 to 40% of a farmer's planting costs. So from an input standpoint, agriculture is heavily dependent on energy markets. From an output standpoint, biofuels. Today, biofuel mandates around the world, whether it's ethanol in the United States, biodiesel in South Asia with palm oil, soybean oil in the US, we are now using basically calories equivalent to feeding 1.9 billion people per day to produce biofuels around the world. So a huge amount of our agricultural production is now actually going to create fuel. So it's linked on the input side, it's linked on the output side. And now we have a war, a Russia-Ukraine war that has caused natural gas prices and access to natural gas in Europe to decline and has sent natural gas prices soaring. In the EU, in the last year alone, gas prices are up over 5 times. In the UK, 4 times. In the US, they've doubled. What does that mean? Access to fertilizer is, 1, significantly more expensive, but 2, impaired, because it's not just an affordability issue, it's actually an accessibility issue. So if you look at this chart over here, what this is showing is the price of natural gas to produce a single ton of fertilizer, nitrogen-based natural fertilizer, in China, India, the US, the UK, Japan, and Dutch gas, but that's basically a proxy for Europe. The bars are showing you what the average cost has been. Basically, the blue line is the median cost this summer. So if you look at TTF Dutch, it says $1,970 per ton to produce a ton of fertilizer, when the price of fertilizer in the UK is selling for $870 a ton. That has essentially caused a huge amount of European capacity to come offline. So more than 70% of fertilizer production in the UK is offline. In Asia and places like Japan and Korea, you have that same problem. The 30% that is being produced in Europe right now is actually not going into fertilizer, it's going back into the energy markets, because nobody in the agricultural markets can afford it. The economics don't work. This is a very dangerous place to be, especially when you take into account inventory levels. The way in which availability was addressed in the agricultural markets this year and through the war, and why things did not get as bad, is that there was sufficient inventory sitting basically within the hands of the companies that produce fertilizer, such as CF Industries or Yara, but also the retailers and the wholesalers. That red line that you see is the pace at which they've depleted inventory. So today, you have an issue where you can't have access to natural gas, you've depleted your inventories, and essentially are going into the winter where natural gas demand is high for heating, and farmers start to buy all the fertilizer in January for next year. This can be catastrophic at a scale we really have not started to imagine. So a few months ago, we partnered with the Gates Foundation, and we built a fertilizer tracker. And this was to estimate what would the impact on global production be if we basically had, under different scenarios, nitrogen fertilizer disappear from our systems. You need to replenish that in your soils every year. You don't have 2 years, you don't have 3 years. You need it every year. We partnered with the IFA, which is the International Fertilizer Association's 400 companies. We anonymized their data from fertilizer companies and said, give us your most pessimistic scenario of what you think would happen. And then we will model that with nitrogen, what's called nitrogen response curves, to understand the response and basically get a forecast of how many calories we'd lose around the world on major crops. That number was about 218 million people's worth of food, simply from lost production. You will see it's not evenly distributed. Africa and Western Europe and Australia will be significantly negatively impacted. However, like I said, we did this at the end of May. Natural gas prices today are much worse than the pessimistic scenario we had painted back then. So these numbers are about to grow, and we're updating them. Now, that is on the input side, but you also need climate to get all of this to work. And for some reason this year, the world is just a lot drier than it ever was. So this map that you see is a map of the whole world using a drought index that we've developed that measures drought on a scale of 0 to 5 for the whole world for every square kilometer every single day. And what you're seeing is that large parts of North America, again, Europe, and Eastern Africa are experiencing extremely severe droughts, droughts that are much worse than they have been in the last decade. In East Africa, we're looking at 4 decades. So again, places that are actually going to be impacted very negatively by nitrogen shortages are the places that are also dry. So in general, when weather conditions are bad, you generally want to optimize your inputs because that's the way you maximize outcome. Now, where are we from a market standpoint? Prices have come off since the highs we saw in April, but they have started to go back up. And it's all largely driven by the fact that US production is down significantly more than most people expected. There is a drought in China. Pakistan is flooded. There are protectionist policies emerging everywhere. So we are far out of the dark. And it is actually, like I said, one of these effects where what happens next year and the year after could actually be significantly worse. But what has happened to the world thus far? So this is an economic impact shock model that we developed that looks at basically how the price of food is affecting economies on a GDP-adjusted basis. So literally, when you look at a country's net imports or exports of food, and how much more or less they're, on a relative basis to their GDP, they're being affected. One of the things that you're seeing here is that just year-to-date price changes, forget what has happened over the last 2 years, are affecting some economies by 3 to 4% of their GDP already, food prices alone. And this could get significantly worse. What is happening on top of that is a very strong US dollar. Local currencies are getting decimated. So the example I would give here is the Ghanaian cedi. It's down 39% year on year. That means that if the price of rice had not moved at all, which it has moved a lot, your import cost is already up by almost 40%. So the cost of living being the #1 concern that people have should not be a surprise, because this is just driven by food systems that are failing us. And this is not limited to Africa, it's not limited to Asia, it's a global phenomenon. Food inflation has slowed down, but it still continues to rise, and we're now starting to see effects that could last multiple years, as opposed to a small shock that came and went. And I think this is something that we should really keep in mind, because CPG companies are only now starting to pass the cost of 2 years accumulated price changes into consumers and into our baskets today. So, the thing that I sort of really think about is, what does this mean for the world? Wheat supplies are very tight. They're actually almost at the lowest levels they've been since 2007, 2008. So we don't have much in inventory in the worlds that already have it. So we're entering this sort of phase where we're already very low on inventories, climate is stressed, and we're stressed for energy. We've also had some very big structural shifts in demand around the world, and this is very big. China became a major importer of grains in 2020, and that is a structural shift. China never used to import most of its core grains. It was largely self-sufficient. It only imported soybeans for protein. Despite the lockdowns you see in China, in 2020, imports were up 83%. In 2021, they were up 143%. And this year, they're almost flat to where they were last year. This is a big change. This is a seismic shift that we're seeing in global markets. And so really understanding what's happening is critical, because this will drive a lot of what happens to humanity over the next couple of years. And you basically pile on a combination of crops, vegetable oils, proteins. Pretty much every part of our ingredient base is being affected through this. And so it really is a time for us to wake up and to pay attention to our systems and to really think about how we handle what is now going to be a challenging year, at least, or more ahead of us. The food security crisis is far from over. The reopening of ports in Ukraine are not a magic fix. Structural demands are here to stay. Climate shocks will persist, and we have to prioritize the availability and affordability of fertilizer. The biggest thing I am most concerned about right now is that, and increasing and making fertilizer both most affordable and accessible to people will really change our outcome. Thank you.